Okay, we have several issues here, but the main thing is we have an objection from the company about Ms. Walker's summary. I'm going to overrule that objection. We want to hear the summary, and then everybody will be, and I need for everybody in here to be quiet while this is happening. I don't need any extra commentary, okay? So we can proceed.
Mr. Chairman, I wanted to make one correction to the record regarding the last hearing exhibit 155. That was the deposition exhibits to Mr. Brown's deposition. I said that there were 23 exhibits to his deposition. There's only 22. It's 1 through 22. And
okay, we'll make that correction to Mr. Brown's, and that's in Exhibit 155.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Walker, could you go ahead and state your full name and your occupation for the commission, please?
Yeah, it's Carlette Lynn Walker, and I'm currently not employed.
And what was your previous occupation?
It was the Vice President of Nuclear Finance Administration with SCANA Corporation.
Ms. Walker, did you...
Ms. Walker, make sure you get closer to that mic so we can hear you well. Thank you.
Ms. Walker, did you provide deposition testimony on 2 different occasions and proceedings related to the VC Summer project?
I did.
You gave a deposition. Did you give a deposition in the state court action on April 24th, 2018?
I think that's correct.
And then you had a second deposition very recently. Did you have a deposition taken on October 30th, 2018 as well?
That's correct.
Have you reviewed the transcripts of your deposition?
Yes, I've reviewed them.
Do you have any changes to make to your testimony given in those depositions?
No.
If I were to ask you during this hearing the same questions that you were asked during those depositions, would your answers to those questions be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, at this time, the ORS would move for admission into the record the transcripts of Ms. Walker's 2 depositions as if given orally from the stand.
Ms. Walker's transcripts from the 2 depositions will be entered into the record as though given orally from the stand.
And Ms. Walker, did you prepare or cause to be prepared under your supervision a summary of your testimony in this action?
I did.
Have we distributed copies of the summary already, I believe? Okay.
What about exhibits? Does she have exhibits to her?
I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Walker's deposition transcript, her 2 depositions includes exhibits 1 through 36, and the ORS would move for admission of those exhibits into the record as the next hearing exhibit number.
Ms. Walker's exhibits 1 through 36 will be entered as hearing exhibit 156.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Walker, could you provide the summary of your testimony to the commission, please?
Sure. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. I know that my willingness to appear in person in these proceedings has been a matter of interest to the parties and the commission, so I wanted to begin by explaining my reluctance to testify in person at this hearing. The events about which I have testified in my depositions and am testifying today were some of the most stressful and traumatic events in my life and things that no one person should be subjected to. My resignation from SCANA, my employer for over 33 years, came at the end of an approximate 2-year period in which I was the victim of a conspiracy of 5 SCANA senior executives to run me out of the company because of their fear that I was not going to support their decision to lie and deceive both the Public Service Commission and the investing community as to the true financial health and construction schedule for the new nuclear deployment known as NND in Jenkinsville, South Carolina. I believe this became apparent to Jimmy Addison during my discussion with him during my year-end evaluation in December 2014, when I began laying the groundwork for me to testify one last time in 2015 and to begin having Kevin Cocombs take on that role after that. As early as the end of 2014, I had begun feeling uncomfortable with the management's lack of involvement in the project and the site management's willingness to accept the consortium's excuses and substandard work products and continue to make contract fixed-price scheduled payments and time and materials non-fixed price payments. From December 2014 until I was put on a special medical leave by the then CEO, Kevin Marsh, in January 2016, I was reprimanded over things that were absurd. One in particular gave me pause and caused me to question my trust in Kevin Marsh. Marty Phelan and Jimmy Addison had made the decision that one of my employees, who was over 55 years of age and had in excess of 30 years of service, should have her pay reduced by 30% after her job had been reevaluated at her request and it came back at a lower level. The employee had poorly responded to the questions describing her responsibilities, and this resulted in the wrong job class being chosen. I brought this matter to Kevin Marsh's attention, and he said he was appalled and with their decision and told me to simply appeal the decision to him and he would have it corrected. Much to my disappointment, 2 weeks passed before I heard back from Kevin Marsh, and when I did, Kevin simply sent me an email and simply remanded the decision back to the same two men that had already approved the decision to cut the employee's salary. This gave me grave concern about Kevin Marsh and what he really stood for. Not long after this happened, Marty Phelan and Jimmy Addison called me to a conference room and absolutely blistered me. Marty said he had a much bigger problem in the room other than the employee and their salary, and that the fact that I was in management was the bigger problem. After he carried on about that for at least 5 minutes, Jimmy stopped him, and then Jimmy started. Marty actually left the office, and Jimmy had a written list of feedback that he had sought out from feedback he had gotten from the executives from SCANA and also from executive feedback that he had sought from a CB&I executive. The comments that he shared with me were horrid, one of which included an allegation that I actually called people names in meetings. It was after this meeting that I realized that there was an orchestrated effort to get me out of the company because they knew I was not going to go along with their decision to lie about the project, to manipulate the stock price, and to maximize their short and long-term bonuses. I came to realize that my trust in individuals for whom I had worked for many years was misplaced. This breach of trust was devastating to me personally and professionally. Significantly affected my health as well. I'm not one to share my personal business publicly, but to demonstrate the impact that these men have had on me, I will share that I am still seeing a therapist every 2 weeks, and I don't see that ending anytime in the near future. I had a severe heart attack in March of this year, for which my cardiologist said it was stress-driven, given that I had my heart checked only 12 years earlier and everything was normal then. I've certainly given 2 depositions in these commission proceedings and related litigation involving the project. These depositions were very difficult, not only because of the intense all-day questioning involved, but also they required me to relive the difficult events that resulted in my resignation from SCANA. I also have incurred legal expenses which are not being reimbursed by SCANA, as I understand SCANA is doing for all of the officers, employed or not, and then all of their employees. I am a certified public accountant in South Carolina. I take that role seriously, and there's an ethic requirement within CPAs. I worked for SCANA for over 33 years, beginning in October 1983. In 2009, I was promoted to the position of the Vice President of Nuclear Finance Administration by Bill Timmerman, the then CEO of SCANA, and I reported to the then VP of Finance, Jimmy Addison. At that time, Kevin Marsh was the CFO, and I had enjoyed a long-standing great relationship going back 20 years plus with Kevin Marsh. Kevin Marsh actually had recruited me back in 1998 to leave the gas transmission subsidiary of SCANA to come join him in the electric side of the company. He and Bill Timmerman had been instrumental in recognizing my work and dedication and rewarded it both with opportunities and growth. In this newly board-approved finance position for the project, Bill had charged me with the responsibility for establishing a team for the project and to implement a control environment that would protect the company and its ratepayers from imprudent cost. And I took that responsibility very strongly. I immediately left the corporate compliance position I was in, and I went to the project. I was also given responsibility for interfacing with various departments in SCANA to ensure that the financial records reflected the transactions of the project properly and that internal and external reporting was dealt with. I also had the responsibility for the associated transmission EPC contract and its construction and the accounting and business team for the operating unit called BC Summer Unit 1. It did not take me long to realize that the project was having serious problems in meeting construction and cost schedules. By 2014, I had become increasingly frustrated with the consortium, which is Westinghouse and CB&I, their inefficiencies in completing work at the project. The inefficiencies were reflected in a figure termed the PF, or performance factor. The EPC contract between SCE&G and the consortium, again that's Westinghouse and CB&I, assumed a certain number of man-hours of labor to complete scopes of work. A PF of 1 reflects the anticipated rate of productivity under an EPC contract. A PF of 2 meant that the work was taking twice as many man-hours as anticipated, and a 3 meant it was taking 3 times as long. Unlike the transmission construction project where the senior executive was at each monthly meeting with the contractor, the senior executive, Jeff Archie, responsible for the AP1000 construction, was rarely at the monthly project review meetings. When he did attend, just like the VP of construction at the site, Ron Jones, he rarely said anything during the meetings. He usually made a few comments at the end of the meeting. Kevin Marsh, after being named CEO, and Jimmy Addison, after being named CFO, never came to a monthly meeting for the project, nor did either one of them ever come to any of the quarterly internal project issue meetings with project managers held in the Casey headquarters for Steve Byrne and Santee Cooper's CEO. Jeff Archie, the Chief Nuclear Officer and Senior Executive VP, also never came to a quarterly internal issues meeting. From the beginning of the nuclear island build, the PF factor steadily rose and never showed any sign of improvement. This is a serious concern because it delayed completion of the project and substantially increased the labor cost and the related indirect cost, which was not a fixed cost for SCE&G prior to the October 2015 amendment to the EPC contract. In other words, there was a risk that the owners would be liable for this increase in unanticipated labor costs. Throughout 2014, I continued to have quarterly meetings with Kevin Marsh, and Jimmy Addison had begun attending those meetings. I began feeling like Jimmy was policing my meetings with Kevin Marsh after the personnel matter debacle. I was intent on continuing to highlight the ever-increasing PF factor and other commercial issues that I would have otherwise briefed Kevin on had he continued to attend the quarterly internal managers issues meeting that he had originally attended prior to becoming CFO. And I made certain that Jimmy understood what the PF factor stood for and the implications it had for both the project, cost, and the construction schedule. So for him to plead that he knew nothing about the project, I completely dispute that, because for at least 1 year, he met with myself and Kevin Marsh on a quarterly basis and was given updates and an understanding of what the PF factor was and the fact that it was rising every single quarter. Despite the consistent increase in these factors, I was never given any feedback or direct direction to organize a discussion with other executives or other project personnel for a deeper discussion into why these factors were not under control. There was little to no reaction. Later in 2014, when it became clear that the construction schedule and costs to complete the project would no longer meet the approved schedules in place with the Commission, SCE&G and the consortium agreed that the consortium would rebaseline the cost and construction schedules, and then the parties would negotiate who was responsible for the increased cost. SCE&G created an internal team to review the consortium's cost to complete construction of the project, referred to Estimate at Completion, or EAC. In my role over the nuclear finance team, the EAC team reported its findings to me, and I would report the findings to the senior executive team. The consortium's incremental EAC cost was $698 million over the approved cost schedule that was currently in place with the Commission. In early 2015, members of the internal EAC team finished calculating that the EAC with the PF of 1.55 would be $1.2 billion, or about $500 million more than that of the consortium's. After we reported the internal EAC team's forecast, I became aware that SCE&G, and actually this was Kevin Marsh's decision with the company of, it was Kevin Marsh, Steve Byrne, Marty Phelan, Jimmy Addison, Byron Henson, Ken Brown, Kevin Cocombs, Skip Smith, and myself, Belton Ziegler, Mitch Willoughby. And those are the only names I can come up with. Kevin Marsh made the decision he was going to go with the $698 million EAC that was given to him from Westinghouse, and he pointed to the piece of paper that had the $698 million on it, and he said, I'm going to go with the $698 million because I've got documentation from Westinghouse that said that this is the EAC. I informed the senior executive team, including Kevin Marsh, Steve Byrne, Jimmy Addison, and Marty Phelan, of my concern that the consortium estimate significantly underreported the expected cost to complete the project. Mr. Marsh responded that he had gotten the number from Westinghouse, so he was going to use it. This disturbed me as well as some of the other members of the project internal team members, so I prepared a file of spreadsheets and other documentation justifying my position as well as the internal team. I gave this file to Jimmy Addison after I walked him through each page of the calculation and explained each assumption and why each assumption was used. This is a duplicate copy of the file that I gave Jimmy Addison. His was red, mine was yellow. I took this home that night and I put it in my safe in my house. After I gave this information to Mr. Addison, he informed me that he had heard the argument for the lower estimate and was persuaded that it was the right cost estimate. He suggested that I bring my thoughts up in the next morning meeting, but when we all met again in the morning, Byron Henson had removed the project team's calculation completely from the agenda, leaving me no opportunity to bring the subject back up for discussion. Altogether, we met at least 4 times to discuss when the EAC should be used in filing before the Public Service Commission. SCE&G went ahead and filed the petition for the new cost schedule using the consortium estimate, despite the advice from its own internal team. I would be able to give you dates certain as to these meetings, but unfortunately, after I had departed from the company, I realized that there was an electronic process in place that was erasing all of my Outlook calendar meetings. I had asked 2 times throughout my 6 years on the project if other people were experiencing their Outlook meetings vanishing from their calendar, because throughout my 6 years, I was never able to turn in an expense report for reimbursement for out-of-pocket expenses, and no one else had that experience. but from time to time, my entire calendar, any electronic Outlook meeting that I accepted would disappear. So all of these Outlook meetings, which would have been held between January and April, were no longer on my calendar for me to be able to look back and see that we had 4 meetings. The only reason I knew about the 4 meetings was in 2015, I actually started doing a manual log so I could keep up with how many times I traveled from Jenkinsville to Casey so I could actually get reimbursed for all the mileage that I was putting on my car. And I found that log after I had resigned from the company. In May of 2015, SCE&G was preparing witness testimony to support its petition to modify the schedules. I was identified as one of SCE&G's witness to support the new cost schedule. At the time, I was scheduled to meet with SCE&G's attorney and some of my colleagues to begin drafting my testimony. My husband required emergency hospitalization care to save his life. With his life at such risk, I stayed with him at the hospital all of the 10 days and for approximately 5 weeks after he was released. While I was out of work, Mitch Willoughby and Kevin Cocombs, with the help of Ken Brown as well as some of my other team members, wrote testimony in my name and filed it. Although I was not, and let me point out, the testimony included the $698 million EAC rather than the $1.2 billion that I was arguing would be the better EAC. Although I was not comfortable with the cost estimate in the 2015 petition as being the best estimate for the EAC, I was under duress when I returned, and so I adopted the pre-filed testimony at the July 2015 hearing. I did so first because I needed health insurance. My husband had just been released from a life-threatening hospitalization. And then I also, in reading the statements in the testimony, I could see where you could construe those statements as close to being true. I didn't feel good about it, but like I said, I felt like if I pushed back and said I was going to refuse to testify, that I certainly was going to lose my job. I felt very threatened. That was at the point where I began losing weight at the rate of about 10 pounds every 2 weeks. Directly after the July 2015 commission hearing, I became aware of yet another concern regarding the company's disclosure to the commission as well as to the investment community. I found out from a colleague that only days before the hearing, CB&I, the construction company that owns the construction schedule, had announced in a project review meeting, the monthly project review meeting, that there was going to be a 10-month delay in the Shill building and that they'd already looked at the schedule and that you could not mitigate this. It was on critical path and the critical path couldn't be changed. I learned that Jeff Archie, the chief nuclear officer, was in that monthly project review meeting and subsequently, the very next week, actually came to the hearings and was there at the night hearing and was also attending day 2, which was Tuesday. And for whatever reason, he felt like he was able to keep that to himself when we were presenting to you, the commissioners, a cost and a schedule that didn't include a 10-month delay. This bothered me because the information would have definitely affected cost and schedule and was material to the commission. After learning about the Shill building delay, I emailed Jimmy Addison about the issue because he was about to make a public disclosure about the status of the project on his quarterly earnings call. I feared this delay was material in fact that needed to be mentioned in the call with a follow-up on the calculation impact to be announced at a later date. He told me he would follow up on it. Jimmy followed up with me after the earnings release, and again I was disappointed to learn that he had called Steve Byrne merely have him call the Westinghouse director and ask the right question about this announced delay. and was able to get the right answer back that the delay would certainly be able to be mitigated. The owner of the construction schedule, again, was CB&I, and they looked at the critical path and said it could not be mitigated by, but the design agent, Westinghouse, knows better than the construction company about what you can and can't be done to move the critical path. I will leave that up to you commissioners to decide whether or not you believe if the schedule should have been able to have been mitigated for that 10-month impact. Other points of tremendous frustration for me came from the lack of concern that the construction managers appeared to have over the poor productivity and construction progress. I would try to raise questions at these meetings about the construction problems, and Ron Jones, the Vice President of Construction, would cut me off and tell me that I needed to take those questions to a different forum. It was frustrating that the very people who should have had the most concern about the construction problems were the least concerned. My push to have the fencing installed with card readers to distinguish the craft workers at the site that were working on scopes of work that had been moved from fabricators to the site that were fixed price work and not T&M or cost plus billing work. This made it impossible for the owner to know if we were paying twice for the work. So we could have people that were being time and T&M work that would simply move over and start doing rework on the module work that was supposed to have been done in Lake Charles, and they could be charging us T&M, but they would be working on the fixed price module work, and we could be paying for them twice because we're paying for the module in a fixed price and then paying for them again while they're doing corrective work on the modules and then billing us in T&M. But I couldn't get anybody to move to install fencing to make it so we could be sure that we weren't paying for those people twice. But we could buy tents and create what Barnum and Bailey Circus would have loved to have had. Lastly, research and development tax credits were earned primarily due to the AP 1000 technology, and despite my push to have these credits reduce the cost of the project to the ratepayers, Jimmy Addison overrode my position and had these tax credits taken directly to stockholders. These tax credits were tens of millions of dollars. Finally, the last straw for me was the October 2015 fixed price amendment to the EPC contract. I believe that the amendment was a bad deal for the ratepayers for a couple reasons. First, the deal allows CB&I to leave the project with no liability or responsibility for its work on the project. They began the work as Shaw at the beginning of the project, which would have been after the signing of the contract in 2008. And here we are in 2015 in October, which would have been 7 years later, and they were allowed to leave the site regardless of any required rework for things that they might have been doing wrong, and they were allowed to walk off the site with no responsibility and no liability for the things they may have done wrong. SCENG has spent a lot of time and money to get CB&I trained and able to do the work that they were currently doing. But they were being allowed to leave, and a new contractor would begin. You were going to have to bring those people on. You were going to have to train them, badge them, and hire their craft laborers. So when they began in January, it was as if you were starting all over. So in January, the Flora Daniel employees were going to be the least effective and the least efficient as they would be for the life of the project from then forward. But yet, Kevin and Jimmy Addison had agreed to make payments in the neighborhood of $100 million every month for, I think it was 6 months. And yet that was twice what we had ever paid CB&I in the way of craft labor. And that made no sense when you're going to have a new contractor who was going to be the least effective in that position, and you're going to double the payment that you've ever made for craft labor. So my take on that is that those interim payments were designed first to finance Westinghouse, and then secondly, to increase its earnings through revised rates so that you could maximize the growth in the stock price, which would also maximize the executive bonuses, short-term and long-term. After the 2015 amendment was executed in a phone conversation in November of 2015, I told Mr. Addison I would not lie for the company. Mr. Addison acted like he didn't understand what I was talking about. The next thing I knew, I got a call from the new VP of Human Resource, Anne Marie Higgins. She said that she had been asked by Jimmy Addison to meet with me to find out what was bothering me, and that she had the authority to come back to either Mr. Addison or to go directly back to Kevin Marsh to report whatever had upset me. I agreed to have a confidential meeting with Kevin Marsh to share with him a few of my major concerns that I thought as CEO he would want to know about. Again, trying to trust that he was a good man and I had known all these years. I was disappointed when I went to his office to find that Miss Higgins was there, but he convinced me that it was not an issue. I shared several issues, one being the culture at Nuclear, another was being that the Nuclear Business Unit was unwilling to abide by some of the corporate policies despite my attempts to encourage change, and my lack of trust in reporting to Jimmy and his filtering information that I thought Kevin Marsh it was important for him to be able to know about the project, given the risk that we had undertaken for the first time in 30 years. In the follow-up meeting with Kevin Marsh that he called with no forewarning, he began explaining that he had decided to do what he had decided to do for each of my concerns that I had brought to his attention. And it was obvious by his responses that he had no intentions of changing anything, and that he was in on everything, to include his unwillingness to want to know the truth or to report the truth about the project. He had already made up his mind that he was going to put me out of work on a special medical leave because of his concern for my health. It was obvious that the project and the stress was taking a physical toll on me just by looking at me at that point. He explained that he wanted me to take time to get away from work completely, rest, and disconnect totally. It was when I closed my car door that I came to the worst reality of my life, that Kevin Marsh was nothing more than a worthless liar because he was only seeking a way to silence me. I'm not sure what happened to me and exactly what point of time it did, but something dreadful happened to me, and I still am not the same person that I was before. I told Kevin Marsh, Jimmy Addison, Steve Byrne, Marty Phelan, and Jeff. I hold Kevin Marsh, Jimmy Addison, Steve Byrne, Marty Phelan, and Jeff Archie all responsible for what happened to me and for what happened at that project. Their ego, greed, and lack of integrity have cost ratepayers, stockholders, and employees billions of dollars.
Thank you, Ms. Walker. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Brown and Ms. Walker are available for cross-examination by the parties and questions from the commissioners, if any.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Guile.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for Sierra Club and Friends of the Earth. Mr. Brown, Ms. Walker, thank you for your testimony. I have no questions.
Other parties? Company?
Good afternoon, Mr. Brown, Ms. Walker. My name is John Challey. I represent SC DN in this case. Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, Mr. Balzer and I will be splitting up the cross-examination today. I'll be cross-examining Mr. Brown, and Mr. Balzer will be handling Ms. Walker's cross-examination. Mr. Brown, if we can just begin on the preparation of your summary. You read your summary into the record today. Did you put the document together itself?
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay. Who assisted you in that effort?
Actually, there was a lot more in my document than what I've presented today. And Mr. Jim Cox, he actually assisted me in reducing it, but very little content in there. In fact, none did he add.
Okay, so you prepared a first draft, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And then you sent it to the ORS for review?
Yes.
Mr. Cox specifically?
Yes.
Okay. When did you prepare that draft?
I prepared that draft on Friday 2 weeks ago.
And then Mr. Cox provided comments that you saw, is that correct?
I actually met with Mr. Cox on, I think it was Tuesday of last week, and I presented him with my draft in that meeting.
Okay.
And so from that point on is when Mr. Cox had it.
Was your attorney present in that meeting?
My attorney was not present in that meeting.
Okay. Please tell me everything that you discussed with Mr. Cox.
I don't understand the question.
I want to know everything you discussed with Mr. Cox during the meeting regarding the preparation of your summary.
I discussed my summary with Mr. Cox that I presented today, in addition to the portions that were removed.
Okay. And what do you recall Mr. Cox telling you about the status of these proceedings at the time in that meeting?
Mr. Cox didn't tell me anything about the status of proceedings
What did-
in that meeting.
So what did Mr. Cox tell you about your summary then?
Mr. Cox had also prepared a summary to be used, and when he got through reading mine, he said, and he read mine while I was reading his, and he said, "You've prepared this. This is you. This is what you want to say." And he threw his away.
Okay. Did you read the summary Mr. Cox had prepared?
I did.
What did it describe?
It was more of a blow-by-blow summary of my deposition and not so much from my heart of what I wanted to say.
Okay. Was there any topic of discussion between you and Mr. Cox other than the summary?
No.
Did you discuss whether or not you would continue to appear live at this hearing?
At that time, I had made a decision to appear.
Okay. Did you discuss with Mr. Cox whether Ms. Walker would agree to appear live at this hearing?
I did not.
Okay. What do you recall? Well, okay, let me ask this question a little bit differently. Was anyone else at the meeting other than you and Mr. Cox?
No.
Okay. Did you... All right, let's move on. So, okay, Mr. Brown, I want to start sort of the substance here by making sure we all understand what it is that you are and are not testifying about today. So first, you were Santee Cooper's representative for the project at the time that the initial EPC agreement was executed in 2008. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And you supported Santee Cooper's, that time your company's, decision to enter into that EPC agreement. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Okay. You're aware that an EPC contract is a turnkey concept, isn't it? That where the contractor is responsible for doing the design, procuring the equipment, and constructing the project?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So you're not here to criticize this initial decision to enter into the EPC agreement with the consortium, are you?
I'm not.
Okay. And you personally also have no issue with the design for the project, isn't that right?
I'm not a nuclear design engineer, so I don't know that I could state that I have problems with the design of the project.
Right. So that doesn't form a basis for any criticism that you might have related to the project, correct?
Did have problems with the status of the design.
Sure. We'll get to that in a minute. But you have no issue with the design for the project, isn't that right?
I have no issue with Westinghouse's design of the AP1000, if that's what you're asking.
That is. Thank you. So when you joined SCE&G, I think it was November of 2009, is that right?
That's correct.
when you joined, you continued to work on the project within SCE&G's business and finance group, isn't that right?
When I was Santee Cooper's representative, I did not. You said I continued. I did not continue. I started with SCE&G, NND Business and Finance.
Okay. But one of your primary responsibilities in this role at SCE&G was reviewing invoices from the consortium to make sure that the right costs were being charged and paid. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Okay. And you have no criticisms with how SCE&G managed the process of reviewing and disputing invoices from the consortium. Isn't that right?
I have no criticism. That was my job.
Okay, and in fact, in your view, the company had adequate tracking and auditing systems to validate invoices and payments to the consortium. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Right. And if you, since you said this was part of your role, if you found something wrong that the company should not have been paying for, you didn't pay for it. Isn't that right?
If we had something wrong that I felt like the company should not be paying for, I reported that as an issue. It was put on a log, and those issues were addressed generally on a quarterly basis, and there were many things approved to be paid for that I recommended we not pay for.
Okay, let me show you a copy of your deposition. You have reaffirmed your deposition at the outset of your testimony today, isn't that right?
Yes.
Okay. We're going to hand out, I think, copies of your deposition to the witness, and then this is tab 1. The reason I'm referring this to you, Mr. Brown, is that I asked you this question during your deposition, and I want to make sure we've got the record straight as to what the answer is. So we're on page 166, line 10. So I asked you what was, in a colloquy, or actually this is Mr. Cox, I believe, that asked you this question. What was SCANA's management's response to CB&I's challenge of certain invoices, or SCE&G's challenge to those invoices as being petty? You responded, they, and that is SCE&G, this is lines 10 through 17, they didn't care. I mean, if we found something that was wrong that we shouldn't be paying for, we didn't pay for it. That's right?
That's right.
That's what you testified in your deposition.
Yes.
So you're saying today, that the same thing, that if there was an invoice that you challenged, SCE&G didn't pay for that invoice, correct?
What I'm testifying is that if I found something in an invoice that I thought we should not pay, I brought it to my superiors who were in decision-making position, and they would make a decision of whether we should pay for it or not, and I supported their decision.
Okay. And you also said that you believed SCE&G did all it could within the bounds of the EPC contract with respect to being stringent in payments to the consortium. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Okay. So that included withholding payments from the consortium in an effort to get the consortium to improve performance, including productivity. Isn't that right?
Yes, within the bounds of the contract.
Right. And you understand that in October of 2015, the owners in Westinghouse entered into an amendment to the EPC agreement that provided the owners with an option to elect a fixed price for the remainder of the project. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And you believe the EPC amendment was a good deal at the time it was entered into, right?
Yes.
I think you described it during your deposition that as such a good deal and so important. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Okay. So that was in part because the EPC amendment shifted the risk of additional cost overruns to Westinghouse. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
And the fixed price option actually incentivized Westinghouse to meet the promised productivity. Isn't that correct?
Yes, obviously.
Right. You understand that Westinghouse was committed to completing this project under the fixed price option in the EPC amendment, even if it resulted in Westinghouse losing money on the project. Isn't that right?
That was my belief at the time. Yes, it was.
And I think you said that their plan was, during your deposition, you told me that their plan, that is Westinghouse, was to complete these projects, have successful plants, and then sell other plants around the world.
Yes.
And that justified, in your mind and to others at SCE&G, the fact that there may be a loss on the actual construction of the project under the fixed price option.
That's correct.
Right. The EPC amendment also paved the way for the release of CB&I and the addition of Fluor as a new contractor for the project. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And you viewed releasing CB&I and adding Fluor as a very positive development, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Right. Isn't it true, Mr. Brown, that prior to the time that Westinghouse filed for bankruptcy, you always believed that this project would be completed?
Yes.
You also believe that SCE&G's decision to abandon the units after Westinghouse's bankruptcy was the right decision, don't you?
Yes.
So let's just sum up what you are not disputing. You're involved in the project either for Santee Cooper or SCE&G essentially since its inception, isn't that right?
Correct.
Right. And you agreed with the initial decision to proceed with the project.
Correct.
And you agreed with the decision to amend the agreement in 2015 to create a fixed price option.
Yes.
You agreed with the decision that the decision to abandon the project was appropriate, right?
Yes.
And you're also not testifying about the Bechtel report, correct?
Correct.
Right. You never saw the Bechtel report, isn't that right?
I saw the Bechtel report about 2 months ago.
Right. And I think you told me during your deposition that from your perspective, the Bechtel report did not bring any new information to people on the site. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
Okay. All right. So you had no responsibility for scheduling on the project. Isn't that right?
Did not have a responsibility for scheduling.
So the only real criticism that I understand from your deposition and from your summary is that you believed, based on work an EAC team did in late 2014, that the remaining cost to complete the project was higher than what the consortium had presented to the owners in 2014. Isn't that right?
I believe that the remaining cost that the owners would see as a result of the then EPC contract would be more than what the consortium had presented as their EAC cost.
And that's work that you did as part of this EAC team, isn't that right?
Yes.
All right.
Well, it's work that I did as part of my job in addition to the EAC team.
Fair enough. So let's talk about this estimate at completion that you conducted.
Yes.
First, in August 2014, you're aware that the consortium provided an updated estimate at completion for the remaining cost of the project, right?
Yes.
All right. And you understand that the consortium's estimate was compiled with a bottoms-up analysis?
Yes.
Right. And so they were starting from scratch, adding up all the costs they expected to incur in building the plants, all the way down to the amount of rebar. Isn't that right?
Actually, you start with the rebar. That's the bottom. And you estimate all of your quantities of different commodities: rebar, structural steel, concrete, pipe, large bore pipe, small bore pipe, electrical cable, instrument cable, terminations, all of those sorts of things. Then you apply unit rates to those to establish a direct craft man-hour requirement.
Right. It's a complicated task, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Right. And you understand the consortium was doing this work for the owners, right?
The consortium was doing this work for the consortium and for the owners.
Fair enough. So I think you told me during your deposition that you recall the consortium's estimate at completion being compiled based on the work of at least a dozen people over a period of at least 6 months. Isn't that right?
Yes.
All right. And the output from the consortium's analysis, the consortium's EAC, as presented to the owners, consisted of reams of paper. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
All right. So the EAC team you were a part of did not try to replicate that bottoms-up analysis, did it?
No, sir. We used the direct craft hours directly from the EAC. So we started with what would be considered one of their outputs, just not their final output. We started with their direct craft hours and went from there forward.
And that's because you didn't have all the information that would have been required to do an estimate at completion of the kind that Westinghouse had prepared, correct?
We did not have the information, the people, or the time to do that.
And you say that in your summary that you presented here today. This is on page 6, that the most difficult and time-consuming tasks in developing the construction cost is in determining the quantities of commodities, applying unit labor rates to establish the estimated direct craft labor hours, and developing the schedule to use in the cost calculations.
That's correct.
And then you said the owner's EAC team did not attempt to duplicate any of this work by the consortium EAC.
That's correct.
And you couldn't have done that work.
You could
correct?
not have done that.
All right. Instead, what you did, the EAC team, was you developed a one-page model based on the estimated labor hours for the project. Isn't that right?
No, that's not correct. We developed a cost model that used as the input, one of the inputs, the direct craft labor hours from the EAC, from the consortium EAC.
Okay, but you didn't have a model that its output would have been the reams of paper similar to what Westinghouse had prepared?
Absolutely not.
Right. And the team, this EAC team, it consisted of 5 people, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, and Ms. Walker was not a part of that team on a day-to-day basis, isn't that right?
He was not.
Okay. Of the people that were on the team, only 2 of you were engineers, isn't that right?
That's correct.
It's you and Mr. Kyle Young?
That's correct. And Kyle was not there full time, so it was really one and a piece.
So if we're talking about engineers on that team, it was you.
That's correct.
All right. And prior to this project, you'd never worked on a nuclear construction project, isn't that right?
Never nuclear.
Right. And you've never been involved in managing a nuclear reactor, right?
That's correct.
Okay. You said Kyle Young was sort of off and on this particular team, but you're aware, are you not, that Mr. Young had never been involved in a nuclear construction project prior to VC Summer, correct?
That's correct.
Right. And you're also aware that Mr. Young had never been involved in managing a nuclear reactor.
Yes.
Okay. So this team, this EAC team, that team spent about a month working on the model and the output that you prepared, isn't that right?
That's correct.
All right.
Well, we spent a month understanding the estimate from the consortium.
Okay.
The model had already been prepared. Our goal was to understand the cost that we got from the consortium, and we've conducted numerous interviews. We looked through the paperwork that we got from the consortium, and so most of the time was spent on understanding what we got.
Right. Okay. And then at the end of the month, after you spent that time understanding what you got, you provided a presentation on the work that you had completed, isn't that right?
Yes.
And that was it?
Actually, we were not complete at that time, but
Thank you for that clarification. It was only your preliminary results of your review, isn't that right?
that's correct.
Okay. And you and that's all you did for this analysis, correct?
We did some work afterwards, but that was the end of our dedicated EAC team.
Okay, I believe you told me during your deposition you provided a presentation, this October presentation that we may look at and that the commissioners have seen in this proceeding, and then that was it.
Yes.
And I asked you what happened next with the EAC, and you said nothing. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, we kept doing our jobs.
Of course.
We kept doing our jobs.
Of course. But on the EAC specifically, you never got to the stage of issuing a final report on your findings, isn't that right? Okay. Now, isn't it true, nobody told you not to write a final report, correct?
That's right.
Okay. You just moved on to other things, did your
We
job.
had work to do.
That's right, exactly. Okay. Now, getting to your criticism, Mr. Brown, do I understand your criticism correct to say that you believe SCE&G should have used a higher estimate of completion than what Westinghouse had presented to the consortium?
First of all, I don't believe I leveled any criticism, and I believe if the goal was to come up with an estimate of what the owners would be paying through the then EPC contract, the output of our EAC team's estimate was more accurate than the output from the consortium's EAC estimate.
And that's in part because you believe your EAC team's output was based on historical productivity, isn't that right?
It was not based just on historical productivity. What was actually done then is we looked at the historical productivities, and also there were several test cases done around site. And what those test cases were, they took a specific task that had been done by a team before. They made sure that all of the materials were there and that all of the drawings had been reviewed and it was constructible. And, if you will, a best case condition. They turned over the drawings and the materials to the crews and said, go build this. In doing that, the performance was monitored on those tasks, and that we used that information as a basis for our to-go PF, because we assumed that things were going to get better. And in fact, had we used the historical PFs, it would have been a much higher number. At that time, I think it was over 2, the monthly PF. So we used a rational analysis of a predictable performance factor to complete.
Okay, the historical productivity factor at the time of this analysis was not 2, was it, Mr. Brown?
Define historical.
The inception to date productivity factor.
Inception to date was not 2.
It was 1.4, wasn't it?
At which time?
At the time that the consortium had provided its revised EAC in August of 2014.
I'm not sure off the top of my head what the inception to date was there.
Okay, let's look at tab 2. We're going to hand that out.
I would just like to add here that the inception to date is not really a good measure to look at, because that includes several months or years of other than nuclear construction work. So
Okay.
what's more important, if you want to look at a extended period, would be to look at the beginning of nuclear construction to date. And I don't know if anybody has that. So you have an inception to date performance factor, you have a beginning of nuclear work till present performance factor, and then you would have a monthly or incremental period performance factor. All of those are important to be reviewed.
Were you aware of the status of commercial negotiations with the consortium at the time you were doing this work?
With regard to the fixed price?
With regard to any aspect of the schedule or cost estimates?
Yes.
You were involved in those discussions?
Yes.
You were involved directly in discussing with the consortium what mitigation plans they had in place?
That was not a commercial discussion. That was a scheduled discussion for mitigation plans.
And you weren't involved in reviewing that schedule, isn't that right?
Until we got the EAC cost, I sat in on the schedule reviews, but once we got the cost, I stepped out of the schedule reviews and moved over into the cost.
And the schedule review is where those mitigation efforts was evaluated more significantly, isn't that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so you may have been aware of certain mitigation efforts, but you weren't aware of all the details of the mitigation because that was being conducted in the schedule review, correct?
That's correct.
All right. Now, what I want to refer you to in this document, tab 2, is the presentation that's behind it. So this is that's behind the AIR request form. This is a presentation, VC Summer Target and T&M Estimate Update. Do you recall seeing this, Mr. Brown?
Let me look through it a minute. I'm going to be honest with you that I do not recall seeing this, but I'm not saying that I was not present when it was delivered. It's just been a while.
You understand this to be the estimate at completion that the consortium had provided to the owners in late August of 2014?
That's what it appears to be, yes.
And it's your testimony here today that you can't recall ever seeing this before?
It's my testimony to here today that I don't remember this presentation.
Okay, fair enough. Let's flip to page 28. This slide is entitled Craft Productivity. You'll see on the slide that it identifies a couple of assumptions here, or one assumption and then an historical fact. First, the second bullet says that current PF is 1.41. You see that?
Yes.
Okay. So does that refresh your memory as to what the productivity factor inception to date was at the time that Westinghouse and the consortium provided their revised estimated completion in 2014?
That just tells me that that's what they used on this sheet. I'm not sure what the current PF was at that time.
Okay.
See a monthly report to see that.
All right. You have no reason to doubt it sitting here today, do you? All right. And then the third bullet indicates that the ETCPF of 1.15. You see that? Begins that way?
Yes.
All right. So you're understanding that the consortium's estimated completion provided to the owners in 2014 assumed a to-go productivity of 1.15, correct?
Yes.
All right.
To be attained within 6 months, which 6 months after we got the EAC, the actual performance was nowhere near 1.15. In fact, it grew every month between receiving the EAC for 6 months out.
Okay. And your EAC team assumed a ultimate performance factor of 1.4. Isn't that right?
At that time, yes.
Okay. And is it your testimony you think it's just coincidence that the current PF identified on this particular slide as 1.41 is the same as the productivity factor that your team assumed?
I think it's just a coincidence.
Okay. You did understand, nonetheless, that the consortium had assured the owners that it would meet that 1.15 productivity factor by the time the project was completed. Isn't that right?
The consortium told us that was their target, and
That's right.
that's what their estimate was based on.
Not only that it was their target, but that they had committed to achieve that productivity level.
They committed to achieve it, but when you're not the one paying the bills, it's not much of a commitment.
And they weren't, but they became the one paying the bills with the fixed price option, correct?
They did, and when they made their commitment and put their money on the line, they would not commit to a 1.15 performance factor either.
Okay, we'll come back to that. But you would agree that it was in SCE&G's best interest to hold a consortium to the commitment to meet this 1.15 productivity factor, correct?
Yes, and I'd like to explain what hold the contractor to that commitment means. It was our recommendation that any performance worse than 1.15, that we not pay for it. We would pay them for a 1.15 performance. Anything over 1.15 is contractor cost.
That was ultimately the recommendation of the EAC team, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
To hold the consortium to its committed and its promised productivity factor of 1.15 and refuse to pay for any amount of costs associated with poor productivity above that assumption, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
But we couldn't refuse to pay. We still had to pay 90%. We could dispute it and withhold 10% and pay 90%.
And of course, that economic arrangement could change, could it not?
It could change.
It could change, and it did change, didn't it, with the execution of the fixed price option?
That's correct.
Right. And you understand that discussions related, these commercial discussions were ongoing at the time the EAC team was actually conducting this work, correct?
Yes, in fact, I was involved in those.
Right. And part of your recommendation was to have senior management bargain for a further commitment, a financial commitment, and an incentive to meet that 1.15 productivity factor, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So that there was more skin in the game for the consortium so that they could meet their promised 1.15 productivity factor.
So that they would have an incentive to meet that.
Right. Now, you do agree that it was in SCE&G's best interest to hold the consortium to a 1.15 commitment, correct?
SCE&G's best interest to withhold payment above a 1.15 performance factor.
Right, and that's in part because an increase in the performance factor would mean higher costs for the project, right?
That's correct.
All right. And those higher costs would ultimately be passed on to ratepayers, correct?
That's correct.
Right. So you would agree, would you not, that it was in the ratepayers' best interest to hold the consortium to its commitment to meet a productivity factor of 1.15?
Would agree that it's in the ratepayers' best interest for SCE&G to not pay above a 1.15 performance factor.
That's right. That's right. And the contractor was telling the owners that they would build these units for this cost. And the owners had every reason to hold them to that cost, didn't they?
Had every reason to, but we didn't have every ability to.
But you had every reason to hold him to those costs, didn't you?
Every reason to not pay, but our contract would not allow us to not pay.
Well, it would not have benefited SCE&G or the ratepayers for SCE&G to have requested this commission to approve a cost estimate that was higher than what the contractor was saying it would cost to complete the project, would it?
Could you say that again, please?
Yeah, it would not have benefited SCE&G, and it would not have benefited the ratepayers of SCE&G for SCE&G to have requested that this commission approve a cost estimate higher than what the contractor was saying it would cost to complete the project in 2014.
Only if we had a mechanism in place that we could hold the contractor to that cost.
That's right, and at the time you didn't. So you agreed with me during your deposition that if the commission had approved a higher cost estimate, like what you were suggesting in the EAC, SCE&G could not have tried to hold the consortium to its commitment to build the plants for a lower price, right?
I disagree with that statement.
Okay, let's look at your deposition, which is tab 1. Page 294. Lines 22 through page 295, line 5.
Or 22.
Yes, sir, and it's up on the screen here. I believe I asked you if the company, if SCE&G had went to the PSC and said, I want approval for costs above what the consortium had provided, based on the fact that we have a productivity factor higher, and then you said, right, I hope indicating that you understood my question, how could, I continued, do you know, how could SCE&G have held the consortium to its promised 1.15 productivity factor? And your answer was?
They could not. And the reason they could not is because the contract did not permit it.
That's
we
right.
had to pay at 90% of a disputed amount.
That's right. So it was not in SCE's best
It
interest?
has nothing to do with how much we filed for and everything to do with the EPC contract.
But if you admitted during your deposition that if we had filed for and sought approval for a higher estimate of costs, we couldn't have held to the consortium to the promise that they provided in 2014. That's what you told me during your deposition, isn't that right?
No, that's not right.
Mr. Chairman, the answer continues below line 5. I'd ask.
He's got the transcript in front of him if he needs to
Chairman,
explain more.
The answer continues down to line 8 of the deposition. I would ask that that be read into the record as well.
The answer, Mr. Challey, is it did not matter with regard to the consortium what the filing was. The only thing that mattered between the owner and the consortium was the EPC agreement. We were bound by that EPC agreement if we disputed a cost to pay 90% of that cost.
Mr. Brown,
Whether we filed for a higher amount or not.
Mr. Brown, you understand that SCE&G was obligated to pay the consortium only the amount that the consortium said it would cost to complete the projects.
That is not true. SCE&G was obligated to pay the consortium the amount that came in on the monthly invoices based on the hours that were actually spent on the project.
And at the time, in 2014, Westinghouse is estimating what those invoices would ultimately cost to complete the project, correct? That's what the 2014 EAC that the consortium had provided conveyed.
That is correct, but the amount that we paid had nothing to do with the estimate from Westinghouse. They were not linked. The amount we paid was only tied to the timesheets that we got at that time.
Timesheets estimated by the consortium
No,
in
sir,
2014.
actual timesheets.
No, let me finish my question, please. Timesheets, and in a total amount of cost that in 2014 the consortium had estimated to be at a certain amount.
The estimate was not related in any way to what we paid. And in fact, in the meeting with the management, I sat next to Kevin Marsh, and I looked to him and I said, Mr. Marsh, I said Kevin, because we were on a first name basis. Kevin, you understand that because of our contract, we have to pay what the actual costs are and not at all related to what Westinghouse estimate says those costs will be.
I understand that, Mr. Brown. My question to you is different. My question to you is the costs, the total costs estimated to complete the project were provided by the consortium in 2014. And they were
Not correct. The consortium provided us an estimate of what they believed the cost would be.
That's right.
There was no reason for Westinghouse to be accurate in their estimate. There was no reason whatsoever for them to be accurate, because they got paid whether their actual cost matched the estimates or not.
That's your testimony as to what the EPC contract required in 2014, but you're well aware that in 2015, an amendment was executed that changed that financial arrangement entirely.
Absolutely.
All right.
I was involved in that as well.
Okay, so, and then sitting here today, Mr. Brown, you understand that SCE&G made clear in its 2015 petition that the cost estimate it was providing the commission was based on the estimate that the consortium had provided to the owners.
Yes.
That's right. And you also understand, Mr. Brown, that SCE&G disclosed to the commission in that 2015 proceeding that the cost estimate from the consortium was based on meeting a performance factor that had not been met on the project historically, correct?
Yes.
Right.
SCE also indicated to the commission that the cost was, the EAC cost was, they believed to be the most accurate representation of what the cost would be.
Well, the company also disclosed, in addition to that, that meeting the assumed productivity factor the consortium had used would pose a significant challenge to the consortium moving forward. Didn't we say that?
Yes.
All right. And SCE&G indicated further that there was no guarantee that these improved productivity assumptions the consortium had provided would be met.
That's correct.
Right. And all that was accurate, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I think you just indicated, but during your deposition I had you read the pre-filed testimony submitted in connection with the 2015 proceeding, and as you suggested, I think the only language you identified as quibbling with or disagreeing with was this sort of accurate and best estimate language. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
All right. And that's because, in your view, the consortium's numbers wasn't as accurate as what you believe your team's numbers were.
That's correct.
All right. But you would agree with me, wouldn't you, Mr. Brown, that that was just your opinion, wasn't it?
No, sir, I would not agree with that.
Well, you understand that these estimates of what the ultimate cost would be on the project were matters of opinion, right?
Yes.
All right. And you further agreed that you couldn't say whether or not Westinghouse would never meet their promised productivity factor.
That's correct.
Right. And you didn't think it may have been doable, but you were aware of other people at SCE&G who thought it could be.
At least they said so.
That's right. And you're aware that their decisions or their views on that regard, and their views in that regard, require certain judgments and assumptions.
Or lack thereof.
Okay, but it's your opinion. It is just your opinion, though, that the estimate should use a 1.4 performance factor, not the consortium's 1.15 assumption.
It is not just my opinion. There's other people that shared the same opinion.
Okay, that's Ms. Walker.
Mr. Cherry, Ms. Walker, Mr. Smith. We could probably take a roll call if we had everybody here.
Okay.
And I might add, Mr. Challey, if you'd look at the historical information that's historical now, was future then, I'd like to know what the end result was of everything. I'm going to testify right here that my estimate was not accurate. It was woefully low, but mine was higher than what CB&I's estimate was. And I'll stand by it. At that time, my estimate was more accurate than the estimate from CB&I.
But with the benefit of hindsight.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, so Mr. Brown, I believe I asked you during your deposition that when you were going through the draft testimony for the 2015 proceeding, you were the only person you recall speaking up in favor of using the higher cost estimate. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And you told me during your deposition that you ultimately accepted the decision to rely on the consortium's estimate for the 2015 petition, correct?
Not because it was more accurate.
But you accepted the decision, didn't you?
I accepted the decision.
And you never raised the issue again?
That's correct.
All right. You never told your supervisor that you believed SCE&G submitted a false cost estimate to the Public Service Commission, did you?
Did not.
You never told SCE&G's internal audit department about that, did you?
I did not.
And in fact, after that one meeting, this one meeting that you recall where you voiced your concern about the estimate, you never told anyone at SCE&G that you believed a different cost estimate should have been submitted to the Commission in 2015, correct?
Never brought it up again.
Right. And that was true all the way through the time that you left SCE&G, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, when you left SCE&G, you didn't raise any issue about inaccurate PSC filings or any other misconduct associated with the project or otherwise, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Instead, I think what you said in your resignation letter is that you would miss the friendships you made at SCE&G and the excitement of working on the project. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
Okay. I'd like to show you tab 6. Mr. Brown, this is appears to be a letter dated July 12, 2016 from you to Skip Smith. You recall this letter?
I sure do.
This is your resignation letter, is it not?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Is this a true and accurate copy of the information you conveyed to Mr. Smith announcing your resignation from the company?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move this as the next hearing exhibit.
It will be entered as hearing exhibit 157.
Okay. So despite these concerns you had that you voiced in one instance in 2015, Mr. Brown, you said in your resignation letter that you enjoyed your time at SCE&G and that you really appreciated the opportunity that was provided to you by the company. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
You continued to say, I wish you all the best, and I look forward to successful completion of the VC Summer Nuclear Construction Project, which you stated at that time was very important for SCE&G, Santee Cooper, and the residents of South Carolina. Is that right?
Sir, I believe that to this day.
Okay, so those statements accurately reflected your views at the time you left the company?
Yes.
And they accurately reflected your views even as of today?
Yes.
Okay. Now,
I don't look forward to completion anymore.
fair enough. Getting back to this 2015 proceeding for just a second.
Sure.
You are aware, as we discussed, that the owners executed the EPC amendment with Westinghouse fairly soon after the 2015 proceeding concluded. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Right. And then SCE&G came back to the Commission in 2016 and received approval for higher costs and a delayed schedule as part of exercising the fixed price option, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And you agree, do you not, that once the fixed price option was selected, the concerns about the performance factor were irrelevant to SCE&G's costs. Isn't that right?
Not totally irrelevant, because if the performance factors were not met, the schedule would be delayed and there would be additional owner's costs. But with regard to EPC costs, that is correct.
So putting aside owner's costs, if we're talking about EPC costs to construct the project with the exercise of the fixed price option, it was totally Westinghouse's obligation, right?
Yes.
All right. Now, in your summary,
If I could add one thing here. In negotiation of the fixed price agreement, Westinghouse added, I believe, $500 million to the cost as they called it a risk premium. But basically that was to cover their risk associated with the labor cost extending beyond where they were at that time of their estimate.
okay.
That's how that price was determined.
Now, your summary refers to certain issues submitted to the Dispute Resolution Board. You recall that?
Yes, that's the $100 million per month actually the true-up of the $100 million per month.
That's right. You are aware that despite any resolution at the Dispute Resolution Board, there was a true-up provision in the EPC agreement, correct?
Yes, I was responsible for putting that in there.
Right. So you said that the true-up provisions were ruled improper, but that's not entirely accurate, is it,
I
Mr.
don't know how
Brown?
they were ruled.
Right.
I just understood that it never was trued up.
It was never trued up, but you do understand that there was to be a credit provided for those payments against the fixed price, correct?
Yes.
Right. So your commentary in the summary about how the true-up was ineffective is not totally complete, because there was still to be a credit applied for the amount of the $100 million payments, right?
No, it still is true, because the cash was out of the door. Once you paid somebody $600 million, if they haven't completed $600 million worth of work, you're still upside down whether they give you a credit for that at the end of the project or not.
But when you're dealing with a fixed price, that credit is intended to make you whole, correct?
Correct, but it's a cash flow issue.
Okay.
Had the true-up occurred, then at the time of the Westinghouse bankruptcy, SCE&G would have had more money in their remaining budget as a result of the true-up than they actually did at the time of the bankruptcy.
Okay. So, Mr. Brown, just to make sure we got the timing here straight. What you're criticizing here today, or if you don't want to use the term, I don't mean to put a word in your mind, in your mouth, but the commentary you're providing today is that you believe SCE&G should have used different numbers in 2015, even though you know that the numbers used in 2015 were rendered moot by the EPC amendment entered into in 2016.
Yes.
Okay. Now,
unless at the time in 2015, if the additional cost had been presented and the project had been evaluated and a decision had been made at that time that it was not worth moving forward because of the additional cost. That's the only caveat.
But you weren't involved at all in determining what additional costs would have had to have been attributed to the project to make it no longer economical to continue with it.
Not at all.
Right. Now, last topic, Mr. Brown. Your summary on page 10, you indicate line 12 that, starting with line 11, others may disagree with what I have to say, but I don't think anyone can disagree that there were many problems and they were not really hard to identify.
Yes.
Right? And then you continue, do you not, to say anyone representing themselves to be experts in management of a major construction project, nuclear power plant, or anything else should have been able to identify most of these issues with review of reports and data available.
Yes.
Okay. And then you conclude this paragraph by saying, I don't think it's reasonable for anyone involved in the project with any of the parties to say that they were not aware of the serious nature of the problems and the potential impacts to both the project cost and schedule in 2014 and 2015.
That's correct.
Okay. Isn't it true, Mr. Brown, that you yourself discussed the consortium's estimate completion with the ORS in 2015?
I presented the consortium's estimate at completion to the ORS.
Right, and Mr. Gary Jones was there, wasn't he?
Yes.
As was Mr. Anthony James.
Yes.
And Miss Allen Powell.
Don't recall if she was there, but she probably was.
Okay. So you conveyed accurate information to the Office of Regulatory Staff, didn't you, Mr. Brown?
I presented the consortium's EAC to the Office of Regulatory Staff.
But you never lied to the ORS, did you?
Did not lie.
Nor did you make any material misstatements to the ORS.
Did not.
All right. And that's because you disclosed, one, that the estimate at completion you were presenting is one that came from the consortium, correct?
That's correct.
And two, that the estimate was based on various assumptions, including an improved performance factor, right?
That's correct.
And three, you disclosed how those assumptions compared to actual performance on the project.
Yes.
That, in your mind, were the critical pieces to you conveying accurate information to the Office of Regulatory Staff when you discussed the EAC, correct?
Yes, and I did present that as the consortium's EAC.
Right. And you told me during your deposition that, in your view, those three pieces are a complete and sufficient picture to describe the estimated completion work that you did.
Can you find that in the deposition?
Do you disagree with that statement?
Say it again.
That what you conveyed was a complete and sufficient picture to describe the estimate completion work that you did.
No, I don't think so.
You told me during your deposition that that is a complete picture. What you told me you conveyed to the ORS was a complete picture to describe the estimate completion we got from our contractor, correct?
I'll just object, asked and answered, and if Mr. Challey has a quote from the deposition, he can read it to the witness.
I'm happy to refer him to it, but I'm interested in just one last question. Maybe we can go faster.
You said it's differently just now.
Okay. So you would agree with me, would you not, that it is a complete picture, what you described, to describe the estimated completion that we got from our contractor?
That's correct.
All right. And in that instance, the reason it was is because you didn't have to connect the dots for the ORS, because they could do the math to determine whether that estimated completion would ultimately be achieved and what the cost impact would be were it not achieved, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And you told me during your deposition that the ORS had access to the information it would need to conduct its own analysis of what the cost would be if the performance didn't improve, correct?
I believe they did. I can't say with certainty, but I believe they did.
So they could have drawn the same kinds of charts that SCE&G personnel drew showing the need to improve the performance factor, right?
I think so.
Okay. Okay, Mr. Brown, that's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's continue. Ms. Walker, are you okay, ready to go? Don't need a break?
Good afternoon, Ms. Walker.
Hey.
David Balser, we met at your deposition. How are you?
I'm good. How about you?
Doing well, thank you. When was the first time that you saw the summary that you read to the commission this morning?
Well, I sent it to Jim Cox last night.
Who was involved in the preparation of your summary that you read?
Myself and Jim Cox.
And describe for
Ms.
me
Walker, get a little closer to that mic so
I'm sorry.
you pick up on live stream. We can hear you in here.
describe for the commission the process that you and Mr. Cox used to prepare your summary.
Mr. Cox reached out to me and asked if he could be of any help for me, and I said it'd be great if you would take a stab at a draft. He did so, and then I went through and made a tremendous number of modifications to the point that I basically rewrote it. His was short. Mine became extremely long. I think I ended up with in excess of 25 pages. And then when I sent it back to him, he asked if he could make recommended reductions. And he made some recommended reductions, and we got back down to 11 pages.
Thank you for describing that process for me. I had assumed that the ORS was involved in preparing your summary because some of your testimony from your deposition that was critical of the ORS was not included, and I want to start there. Do you recall...
Repeat what you just said?
In your, I had assumed that the ORS, through its counsel, had been involved with you in the preparation of your summary because the summary did not include testimony that you had given in your deposition that was critical of the ORS, and that's where I want to start with my questioning. So you remember I took your, actually, you recall a couple weeks ago you were deposed and Mr. Cox asked you questions in your deposition. Do you remember that?
I do.
And at page 235 of your deposition, Ms. Wilson's going to hand you a copy of it there for you. Mr. Cox asked you a question, and he said, would you agree, Ms. Walker, that SCE&G was limiting information that could be presented to ORS on the project? That's it. Page 235, line 24 is where it begins. And your answer was, I wouldn't say that. I mean, they were pretty open with the information. You recall that testimony?
I do.
And in the summary that Mr. Cox helped you prepare, that testimony that I just read to you is not in your summary, is it?
No, I don't think it is.
And the testimony that I just read and that was on the screen that's in front of you was true and accurate, was it not?
This?
Yes.
Yeah.
And you understand another point that the ORS chose not to include in its draft of the summary for your testimony today was the testimony that you gave about the ORS having access to the historical performance factor information regarding the project. I'd like to direct your attention to page 70, line 12 of your deposition. And this was a question actually that I had asked you in your deposition. I asked, did you ever recall any discussions with any representatives of ORS about the historical performance factors being achieved on the project? And your response was, I'm sure I would have, because, I mean, they would get the monthly review packet, so I'm sure we would have talked about it if they would have asked about it. And then I asked you, and in the monthly packet you're talking about, those are and you said the slides from the monthly review meeting. And I said, in every one of those presentations, and you said decks, and I said slide decks, there was a calculation of what the performance factor was at the time, correct? And you said, right, every month. And I said, and the ORS got those, and you said, uh-huh. Do you recall that testimony?
I do.
And it was true and accurate when you gave that testimony, wasn't it?
It was.
And then another piece of testimony that the ORS elected not to include in its draft of your testimony
You're
referred to...
misrepresenting my summary. That's my summary.
And the ORS was involved with you in preparing that summary, weren't they?
Most of what the ORS attorney wrote, I took out, and I wrote my summary.
All right, so let's look at page 233 of your deposition, line 18. And you recall Mr. Cox asked you, Mr. Cox, who's the lawyer for the ORS, who provided you a draft of your testimony here, he asked you, and Ms. Walker, in your interactions with the ORS personnel that were overseeing the project, what was your impression of the diligence of those individuals? And you responded, I think the ORS staff, where they tried, I was extremely disappointed in Dukes Scott when he made the decision to not have Gary Jones's testimony filed, and he tore it up and he had him stay in Chicago. To me, that's fraud. Do you recall that testimony?
I do.
Can you explain to the commission why you think Mr. Scott committed fraud on the Public Service Commission?
I mean, it's just what I wrote or what I said here. I mean, you had a consultant, ratepayers paid for the consultant because those billings came to the company. And then Mr. Scott made the decision not to have Gary Jones come to the hearing in 2015 despite him preparing pre-filed testimony. And as I understand it, the pre-filed testimony was not supportive of SCE&G's filing request. And so to me, not allowing the public to hear Gary Jones' opinion that they were paying for, I think that that's inappropriate, and I would expect that to be considered fraud.
I want to ask you this question. You heard Mr. Brown testify in response to Mr. Challey's questions. Do you agree with the testimony that Mr. Brown just gave on cross-examination?
Yeah, I did.
Okay. Is there anything about Mr. Brown's testimony that you didn't agree with?
No.
All right, let's talk for a minute about the 2015 proceeding that you discussed in your summary. And just to set the timeline, just to orient you, in March of 2015, SC&G filed a petition with Public Service Commission, correct?
That's correct.
And as the Vice President of Nuclear Finance, you provided sworn testimony in support of that petition, correct?
I didn't participate in the writing nor the filing. The company did that. Yes, I know that to be true.
We'll come back to that.
Well, that's a pretty important fact.
I agree with you, and we'll talk about that just as we did in your deposition. But let's talk about your testimony live before the commission on July 22nd, 2015.
Okay.
You came before this commission on July 22nd, 2015, and testified just as you're testifying here today, correct?
I did.
And let's look at page 592 of that hearing transcript, which is exhibit number 10 from your deposition. And in that hearing, you were administered an oath just as you were administered an oath by Ms. Wheat this morning when you appeared, right? You testified that you were telling the truth under oath.
I would expect so.
Okay. And after taking that oath on July 22nd, 2015, you were asked, Ms. Walker, did you cause to be prepared and pre-filed direct testimony consisting of 37 pages? And what did you say under oath in response to that question?
I did.
And then you were then asked if you had any corrections to your testimony or the accompanying exhibits. Do you remember that?
Not really.
And you said that, if we can pull that up, Dan, you said that you did, right? This is at page 592, line 12. Are there any corrections? You said yes. Would you direct our attention as to where? And then you walked through in some detail what the corrections to your testimony were. Do you recall that?
No.
You have no reason to doubt that the transcript that reflects your corrections to your testimony is true and accurate, do you?
No.
Now, if we go to page 593 of your testimony that you gave in July of 2015, you were asked under oath, and I quote, if I asked you the same questions that appear in the testimony as corrected, would your answers be the same from the witness stand here today? And you answered they would be. Isn't that true?
That appears to be correct.
So in July of 2015, you swore under oath before this commission that the testimony that you were providing in the 2015 proceeding was true and correct, correct?
That's correct.
And then I asked you again in your deposition a couple weeks ago to confirm that your 2015 testimony was in fact true and correct. And if we go to page 108, line 23 of your deposition, I asked you, and I quote, in your testimony before the Public Service Commission that was presented and that you validated was true and accurate, was it not? And what did you say?
That it was correct.
And in addition to providing your own testimony in 2015, you sat in this very room and watched the other SC&G witnesses testify in 2015, didn't you?
I did.
And you understand that ultimately there was a settlement that was reached in connection with the 2015 docket. Do you recall that?
Not really.
And you don't recall that you expressed the fact that you were very pleased with the terms of the settlement in 2015?
No, not at all.
Okay, let's pull up tab 6. Ms. Walker, you have been handed an email string between you and Mr. Addison dated June 30, 2015. Mr. Addison says to you, how are things going, Carlette? You respond, I guess pretty good. He, and you're referring to your husband, Gene, is scheduled for a surgery next Monday and an important follow-up from the surgery with his nephrologist on Tuesday. Hopefully these 2 days will go better than the previous 6 weeks. I'm planning on taking PTO both of those days. On another note, my meetings today and yesterday seem to be running longer than expected, so it may be later this evening before I'm able to complete updating my performance evaluation. I was really pleased to see the terms of the settlement. I think it was a very reasonable settlement for all parties. Mr. Addison responds, thanks for the update. You all stay in our thoughts and prayers. If you need even more time on the review, no problem. The weekend is fine. I agree on the settlement should make the hearing much better too. Thank you. And you respond, thank you for the prayers. That's a true and accurate copy of the email string between you and Mr. Addison, isn't it?
I don't remember.
You have no reason to doubt that this is a true and accurate email that you sent to Mr. Addison telling him that you thought the settlement was a very reasonable one for all parties, correct?
I would think that it's accurate.
I move for the admission of this document as the next hearing exhibit, Mr. Chairman.
It'll be entered as exhibit number 158.
All right, Ms. Walker, you wanted to talk about, and I'm willing to talk about it with you, the preparation of your testimony in 2015. And if one were to look at the summary that you and Mr. Cox prepared, one could be left with the impression that your testimony was filed in 2015 without any input from you. Are you telling the commission that that's what happened?
That's exactly what happened.
All right, Ms. Walker, let's look at Exhibit 8 of your deposition, which is tab 18, Dan. You recognize this document as Exhibit 8 to your deposition. We talked about it in your deposition. This is a calendar invite from Ms. Karen Scruggs. And Ms. Scruggs is a paralegal at SCANA, correct? SCNG.
I think so.
And there's a calendar invite to you and others, and the date of that calendar invite is April 14th, 2015, correct?
Yes.
And the subject of the calendar invite is to discuss Carlette Walker's testimony. See that?
I do.
And that this was sent on April 14th, 2015 for a meeting scheduled between 12:30 and 4 p.m. on April 15th. Is that correct?
It looks like that.
Okay, let's look at Exhibit 9 to your deposition, which is tab 19, Dan. And the document that was marked as Exhibit 9 to your deposition, and that is in the record, is an acceptance by you of the calendar invite that we just looked at that was Exhibit 8 to your deposition, is it not?
Can you repeat the question?
The document that's in front of you now is an acceptance that you sent from Carlette Walker to Katrina Thompson, accepting the meeting invite to discuss your testimony, and it was sent on April 14th, 2015 at 3:20 p.m., correct?
Yeah, I don't know why it's Katrina Thompson when it supposedly came from Karen Scruggs, but whatever you say.
You don't dispute that you accepted the calendar invite that we looked at as Defendant's Exhibit 8, do you?
Well, I mean, it doesn't look like the same meeting because this to Katrina Thompson, the invite came from Karen Scruggs, so it looks like a different meeting.
Tell the commission what the subject line of the meeting that you accepted says.
To discuss Carlette Walker's testimony.
Tell the commission what the invitation to the meeting that was marked as Exhibit 8 to your deposition says.
To discuss Carlette Walker's testimony. But you don't see Katrina Thompson anywhere on the meeting request with that title.
You know who Katrina Thompson is?
No. Do you?
The same rules apply here as apply in your deposition. Unfortunately, Ms. Walker, I'm the one that gets to ask the question. So,
Well, I mean, I'm just curious.
so let's look. We're not going to go through every single meeting that you attended before your testimony was filed, but because you have now staked out a position that you had no review and no input into your testimony, we do need to look at a few of these meetings and meeting invites that do reflect that you were in fact involved. So let's look at.
Well, let me bring up one thing.
Let's look at tab 20. Ms. Walker, let's look at the document that was marked as Exhibit 15 to your deposition. This is for a meeting Wednesday, April 22nd, 2015. Subject, NND, initial review of testimony sent on behalf of Byron Henson by Cynthia Westmoreland. And you see your name listed as someone who was invited to that meeting.
Yes, and I can assure you that that was a review of one of the senior executives' testimonies.
You're testifying under oath that this review, NND of reviewed direct testimony on April 22nd, did not involve your testimony. Is that what you're testifying under oath?
Is that in March of 2015?
Correct.
Yes.
No, April 22nd, 2015.
I don't believe that was my testimony. I think my testimony was written in the month of May.
Well, we already saw, and we don't need to belabor the point, but we saw a meeting invite that you accepted regarding discussion of your testimony on April.
But the discussion of my testimony doesn't mean that we were in the midst of writing my testimony. There were several meetings where I was still concerned about what dollar value was going to be put in my testimony. I had records as to what those meeting dates were, but I no longer have those records.
All right, Ms. Walker, let's look at the document that we marked as Exhibit 16 in your deposition. And Dan, this is tab 21. This is an email exchange between you and Cynthia Westmoreland dated April 20th, 2015, in which Ms. Westmoreland says that she's going to be ordering lunch for the meeting on Wednesday, April 22nd. And again, the subject is Wednesday meeting. And you responded, "I would love a TSHM, thank you." And you told me in your deposition that that's a sandwich, right?
That's correct.
And so you at least told Ms. Westmoreland that you wanted lunch for the Wednesday meeting on April set for April 22nd, 2015, correct?
That's correct.
Let's look at the document that we marked as Exhibit 19 in your deposition, which, Dan, is tab 24.
Are we going to talk about what I responded in the deposition on that one?
Tab 24, Dan. Well, let's go back. All right. Well, we'll start with 24, which was Exhibit 19 in your deposition. And this is an email that you sent to Mitch Willoughby on May 6, 2015, that said, "Hey, Mitch, I looked at our calendars, and we are pretty booked up. We're meeting this morning from 9 to 11:30 to prepare slides for the meeting with the IRS. And then from 11:30 to 2, we have the corporate insurance folks coming in to meet with us to discuss the basics behind our OSIP policy, and then to discuss the OSIP variants and documentation for the IRS to support the filing. I have a personal medical appointment, 2:30 this afternoon, and likely won't be able to return to work. What about tomorrow morning before we start reviewing testimony, ? Or afterwards?" That's an email that you sent to Mitch Willoughby on May 6, 2015, is it not?
Correct.
Okay. I want to talk now, Ms. Walker. Your husband, Gene, was hospitalized on May 21st, 2015, correct?
I think that's right.
And that was a sudden event, was it not? It was not expected.
I was out prior to that date because he was becoming ill.
His hospitalization was a surprise, was it not, Ms. Walker?
I told you I was out 2 days before his hospitalization.
Was his hospitalization a surprise, Ms. Walker?
He went to the emergency room.
It was a surprise, wasn't it?
It was.
Thank you. And until he went into the emergency room, you were at work and you were attending meetings, as we've just shown the commission, on numerous occasions to discuss your testimony. Correct?
That's not accurate. I was home with him for 2 days, and on the third day, I insisted he go to the emergency room with me.
Let's talk about the events that led up to the departure from the company. You're not suggesting to the commission, are you, that you did not have actual health issues?
I didn't suggest that.
Okay. You weren't suggesting that Mr. Marsh created some sham excuse around your health as a reason for putting you on medical leave.
I didn't say that either.
Now, you did testify that the stress, you testified in the summary that was prepared, that the stress that you felt was a result of the events that occurred at work, right? That's what you said earlier today? That these men had caused this stress in your life, right?
The project.
Yeah, I think you said it was you were a victim of these 5 people who wanted to run me out of the company, right? Those were your words?
That's right.
All right, let's look at document that we marked in your deposition as exhibit number. Oh, we didn't mark it. It's tab 11, Dan. This is an email that you sent to Ms. Anne-Marie Higgins on November 12, 2015. I believe you testified that Ms. Higgins was in the HR function at SCANA. Is that right?
Yes.
And on November 12, 2015 at 1:42 p.m., you sent an email that said, "Hey, Anne-Marie, I thought I might be able to give you some insight into a health issue that my husband's having so I can avoid having to tell you of it tomorrow. Is talking about it evokes a tremendous amount of emotion in me. Without getting into all the details of that condition on the record, you go on to say, this personal matter has created a tremendous amount of stress in my life. Granted, the project has been a stressful job, but the reality is that my work and the team I have had the privilege of working with has been the one thing that I've always treasured and found rewarding. But that stress is not what has caused my health issues. The stress of his illness and the thought of losing him is the stress that has flipped my apple cart over." And you go on to say, "I hope this will help you to understand why my perspective of everything else in my life feels out of control and has driven a skewed view of everything." That was a true and accurate email that you sent to Ms. Higgins on November 12, 2015, isn't it?
No, it wasn't accurate.
Oh, you were lying to Ms. Higgins?
Yeah,
You were? Why were you lying to Ms. Higgins?
because Miss Higgins was part of the conspiracy. Miss Higgins is known in the company as a witch. She was part of the hunt to come get me. When I asked for a confidential meeting with Kevin Marsh, he wouldn't grant me that. She was in there representing HR. She was in there the second time that I met with him whenever he was going to give me the feedback. They had already decided that they were going to put me out on a special medical leave, and that was actually my departure.
Mr. Chairman,
You can make that into anything you want to, but all I was done was reprimanded over and over.
Mr. Chairman, I move that this exhibit be entered into the record as the next hearing exhibit.
It will be entered as Exhibit 159.
Ms. Walker, that same day on November 12th, 2015, you sent an email to Mr. Addison that we marked as Exhibit 27 to your deposition. Dan, this is tab 12. You said in this email, and we start at the bottom, "Hey, Jimmy, I've had some time over the last week to do some real soul searching, and I would like to ask you for some of your time so I can apologize and explain why my behavior and how my perspective over the last 6 months has gotten so screwed up, and to genuinely apologize for how I have lost my perspective and all semblance of humility and allowed myself to become so self-righteous. I have given a lot of thought to what you said to me on the phone several weeks ago, and you have been right. I would appreciate, you said estate, but I think you meant appreciate, the opportunity to right my wrong and extend my appreciation to you and Kevin for allowing a personal crisis to consume me and take up a war against the very people that have afforded me a career that exceed anything in my wildest dreams. If you have any time today or tomorrow to meet with me, I would be very appreciative. I'm attending a CPE session in downtown today, but would love to miss a session so I could meet with you to express my apology. The person I have become over the last 6 months is not the person I want to be known as. Thank you for your consideration, Carlette." Mr. Addison responded to you. He said, "Carlette, glad to meet with you and hear your perspective. As I've said all along, I just want what is best for your health. Unfortunately, I'm in D.C. tomorrow, etc." And he said, if not, we'll work something out to meet. And you said in response, "I would appreciate your willingness to meet with me early Monday morning. I just hate to ask you to come in early Monday. My health is going to be fine, not to worry about that. I need to apologize for losing the very virtue I've always wanted to be known for having, and with much thought and reflection, I see that I've become a self-righteous, horrid person that I never wanted to be, and that will only serve to make the rest of my life one of regret. I owe you an apology and need to take ownership for more inappropriate behavior and perspective. I need to eat some humble pie, as you were correct on so many fronts. Any time you would be willing to give me would be greatly appreciated. Please let me know of any time you are willing to give me for my apology. Thank you, Carlette."
That is what you call creative writing, because that's what Jimmy Addison wanted to hear. Just like the other one is what Anne Marie wanted to hear. If you've got 5 executives trying to beat you up to run you out of the building and out of the company, that's what you have to revert to.
Dan, let's look at tab 13.
Chairman, may I make a request? I believe my client is getting a tad on the tired side. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. If there's some way you might take...
You're going to have to get to a microphone.
I'm sorry. If there's some way we might take a 5 or 10 minute break at least. I think we've been going for a while, and she does appear to be getting a tad on the stress side.
We'll take a break. Is that okay?
5 minutes?
About 10 minutes.